Once more, dear friends, we find ourselves on the precipice of dread, a shroud of unnerving quietude draped around our shoulders. The brothers' horror are back, and with us, the blood fog. It coils at our feet, a carnivorous beast feasting on the dying light, painting the world in a crimson hue of nightmares. Today, we venture into a chilling tale woven in the fabric of the night, a tale of a creature born in the heart of terror itself. From the shadowed corners of folklore and the cold heart of the blood fog emerges a sinister silhouette, a skinwalker. The night is heavy with the scent of dread, and the moon, pale and watchful, hangs low. We find ourselves standing at the threshold of fear, gazing into the abyss of the unknown, where the grotesque and the horrifying lurk. The air is thick with whispers of the Skinwalker, a creature of many faces, shifting like the shadows under the moonlight, drawing its life force from the echoes of the damned. Within the blood fog lies a realm of the grotesque, a world dripping with the horrors of the unearthly and the supernatural. Veins of terror pulse beneath the surface, bearing the ghastly tales of those who've dared to encounter the Skinwalker. Oh, the horror that unfolds when the night wraps its cold fingers around your throat, when the rustling of leaves is a sinister incantation, and every shadow is a chameleon creature. So brace yourselves, our courageous nightcrawlers. Join us as we lift the veil of the blood fog, peel back the layers of the dark, and delve into the bone-chilling lore of the Skinwalker. Prepare your hearts for the terror that lurks just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed.
This is a true story detailing something that happened to my wife and I 3 years ago. So, my wife and I lived in a renovated pool house on my uncle's property, up in a secluded, posh neighborhood in the mountains of SoCal. The community was quiet, given the economic status of the residents, and the fact that it was several miles up the mountain, far away from the urban neighborhoods. The community was also gated, keeping it even more secluded. That being the case, the only real traffic was people who lived in the community coming up to their MC mansions. There are 2 ways up the mountain, one approach from the south and one from the west. Either way, you must drive several miles up narrow, windy, one-lane roads that both lead up to these razorback ridges in order to reach the community gates. For those who don't know, a razorback ridge is a narrow ridge with steep 100-foot or more drops to the bottom. Sorry for the long details, but I promise this is all important. So one night, wife and I are hanging out with family who live down the mountain in the San Bernardino Valley. We are there till about midnight, then decide it's time to get home. We start driving, and as time goes on, the houses and street lamps get more sparse, and the darkness encroaches as we hit the base of the mountains. As we start to drive up the mountain, the street lights are absent, and the lights of houses are gone. Nothing but darkness, and our 2 headlights. About halfway up, a fog starts to develop. Nothing too uncommon for the area, just a little dangerous given the windy roads and how late at night it is. People have literally driven off the windy roads and died in the valleys below, even when there wasn't fog out. So I slow down and stay extra attentive to the road. The steep part of the ascent was over, and we reached the Razorback Ridge, just a few more miles till we get home. When we reach the top of the ridge, the road levels out, and the fog grew thicker, limiting my visibility to 100 feet or so. Suddenly, I make out a large shape in the fog and catch the reflection of my headlights bouncing off a mirror surface. I slowed down and came to see a new silver Mazda crossover in the road. The car was not merely parked in the shoulder or even in the traffic lane, it was literally in the middle of the road. The back half of the car was in the lane opposite us, and the front half was in our lane, as if someone had come from the opposite direction and veered onto our side and just stopped there. This is particularly odd because that either means someone came from our community several miles further down the way, or had driven all the way from the other approach up the mountain, bypassing our community, which is the only thing really up there. In either case, it made no sense for someone to be coming out this way at this time of night, and to have stopped their expensive car at this point in the road. Furthermore, the car was empty. Lights were off. Doors were all shut. The car was not running. and nobody was nearby. There were no flashlights shining, nobody calling for a lost dog, no flat tire, no houses or trails nearby, just the road, the fog, the silence, the cliffs, the empty car, and my headlights. As I slowed down and absorbed the scene, the only thing I could think was, this is a trap. And every horror movie and survival video game I played told me that bandits, or creepy creatures, were going to pop out soon. That being the case, I retrieved my handgun and stopped the car, but didn't put it in park. My wife was also taken back and muttered, "What the heck is this?" I said I wasn't sure and that I was going to call out to see if they needed help. Despite the creepiness, part of me still thought there was a rational explanation and that someone needed help. I cracked my window a bit and listened. No voices, no engine running, no wind. Just the barely audible soft hum of my engine, which goes into eco mode when stopped. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Nothing. "Do you need any help?" Nothing. I started to clench my pistols, grip tighter, and moved my finger slightly closer from the slide to the trigger, anticipating an attack. Still, nothing. After having been there about a minute in total, I said the dumbest thing in my life I actually thought, and said, "You think I should get out and investigate?" My wife looked at me like the dumbass I was and said, "This is creepy, let's go." I still feel dumb for saying that, and as it left my lips I realized I was sounding like some generic horror movie extra about to get killed in the first 5 minutes of the film. At that point, I realized it was time to go, and I started to slowly drive around the car, scanning for movement in the fog and the vehicle. Again, nothing. We finished our drive home and talked a little and went to bed. For the next week, I checked Facebook community pages and local news for anything connected to it. Maybe a missing person report, or a missing dog alert, or even just other people who saw the car. But nothing came up. I drove that path dozens more times at that hour, but never saw anything like it again. I still don't know what that was about, and still can't rationalize it without copping out with the "it was just an elaborate prank" excuse, which honestly seems impossible and ridiculous as well. To be honest, it seems like the road was intentionally blocked, but I do not know who would intentionally block a road with a very expensive car on a windy, dangerous mountain road in the middle of the night in the middle of severe fog. Still a strange and creepy mystery to this day.
I am Puerto Rican, and I live in Brooklyn. But when I was young, I often spent summers in my grandmother's house in Yauco, Puerto Rico. She had a lot of land deep in the mountains, so deep that roads would go off into the wilderness through narrow mountains passes where cliffs were just a few inches off the tire driving in pitch black. If a car came in the opposite direction, either they or you would have to drive in reverse until you found a place to pass each other. It was scary. The property has been with my family for a long time, and my family has been in Yauco as far back as anyone can recall. I used to spend a lot of time with my great-grandfather Papito, who farmed the land and took care of some cows. He was very old. He was nearly 100% Taino indigenous Puerto Rican. From him, I would hear stories about the Indios who lived in the wilderness when he was young, who were not culturally assimilated into colonial society after hundreds of years of Spanish occupation. My family would often hide and harbor the culturally wild Puerto Ricans, culturally indigenous, because if Spanish locals found them, los matan, they would kill them. I had my first brush with mortality there, at age 6 or so, crushing the jelly bean-sized eggs of salamanders I found in the brush, and watching the pink, underdeveloped hatchling run for cover on instinct. My grandmother told me what I had done was wrong, and I instantly knew why. I was filled with cold shame, and I cried. Papito told me about strange flying discs he would see coming to the mountains and submerging into the lake. He told me about the spirits in the valley, that you could hear them, and to be careful walking around the roads of the mountains at night on my way from his house to my grandmother's. He taught me how to control a bull with its horns and how to ride it. He did a whistle only he could do when he wanted to gain the attention of an animal on the mountain that made them either follow him, go where he directed them, or just to settle down. He told me about the legend of Diego Salcedo, which took place there in Yauco. When he was almost 100, Papito was dying, and all of our family came to see him. He was a link to an old time, and so many people in Yauco knew him. They all went to his house. Uncles, aunts, cousins, people from nearby, all gathered at his house on the top of the hill. I was too young to be present for his passing. I sort of didn't understand what was going on at the time. I was sent down to my grandmother's house to wait for the proceedings to be over. The sun was going down. The mountains were like shadows rising around me. Walking alone, I started to hear animals all about, crying out, wild dogs all over the mountain. Chickens were making a ruckus. The pigs in the lower valley were screaming almost like humans. The cows were howling in a way that I can only describe as similar to Cat Stark from Game of Thrones when Robb died. Every single non-human thing in the mountain within earshot was wailing in a fashion that I have never heard before, nor since. As a little kid, you can imagine how frightening that was, especially because I was alone. I hid in the house, looking out the window waiting for my grandmother, listening to the animals cry. I was especially sensitive to sound then, as it had been a time in my life where I was often sick and constantly on the medicine amoxicillin, which I was allergic to. It created this sort of overwhelming, extrasensory sound experience. At some point, all the animals stopped making noise. I was thankful. Before bed, I asked my grandmother what happened, why all of the animals were making that sound. She told me that Papito had just died, and that all of the animals on the mountain had realized the powerful being that protected it for so long was gone, that they had seen his spirit pass, and it was sensible that this change would affect them very deeply. My grandmother's perspective was that the animals just know these things. I couldn't sleep. I went outside late at night, curious and scared out of my wits, thinking about the spirits that may be out in the darkness of the mountain wilderness, thinking about that terrible, painful lamentation that was embodied by animals crying like people. I went close to the edge of one of the small nearby cliffs that hung over an endless darkness, and I squatted and listened. I heard a sound that scared me, a feral yell in that darkness. I don't know what dog it was, or if was a dog at all, but it was certainly too close and I was by myself. It howled and yelped, and I regretted coming outside. I was sort of frozen there, afraid to move, but afraid to stay. I wouldn't dare call out for my grandmother. I would be scolded for coming out and wandering around at night. She probably wouldn't hear me anyway. A moment later, I heard that whistle that Papito used to do. Out in the darkness, the howling stopped. As a child, I didn't think, that couldn't be Papito. He's dead. Like any adult in their right mind might. I thought, it's Papito. It had to be. No one else could do that. No one knew how to whistle that way in my family, and it was only us for miles around, on the mountain. Where the sound came from, it would be impossible for any person to be, not even during the daytime. It was deep inside of the wilderness on the severe cliffside, but I knew he was there, as I am sure that at that age the line between life and death was blurred. Yauco is the area where Aguebana I, the chief of the Taino, lived. It is also where the rebellion began against the Spanish, with the drowning of the conquistador Diego Salcedo. Many of the surviving Taino escaped into the mountains of Yauco and lived in secrecy there for a long time, hiding their lifestyle behind some of the more assimilated natives, like Papito. They say the Taino are extinct, but that cannot be. I knew some of them. I am one, if only a little bit.
Hello all. I've shared a few times in this group and wanted to share a personal experience that occurred 2 weeks ago. If anyone has read my other stories, you know they are not very fanciful or extreme, nor are they based on the paranormal. Rather, they are based on very real physical threats. I would say even a skeptic would agree my past stories are tense because of the physical dangers presented in the situations. But today the tone will change. 2 weeks ago, deer season started up and I decided to venture into the wilderness in an area I saw while doing a little electronic scouting on Google Earth. The area I wanted to get to is public land that is surrounded by private ranches, so I sleuthed around to get info on some of the big ranches. Eventually, I contacted a rancher and got permission to travel across their land to the mountains and forests. Of course, there were conditions. They said I must only hike or ride a bicycle through their land, the first mile of my adventure. And I could not start any fires on their land. Very reasonable conditions for free passage and hunting permission. So, with permissions attained, I prepped the gear for my trip. My mountain bike, straps to hold down my pack itself with my hunting and survival gear including water and food, my clothes and my rifle for the day, a Mauser 98K. I chose this because the design is very streamlined with no soap or charging handles to snag, and the bolt can lock to prevent snagging and accidentally opening it while riding with it on my back. With my gear ready to go, I was up at 4:30 a.m. and out at the gates of the ranch at 5:30. It had rained the night before, so any tracks I saw would be new, and my movement would be muffled. A great hunting day in the making. I saddled up by bicycle and rolled onto the dirt road. Before I go on with the meat and potatoes, I will say that I'm not a novice outdoorsman. I've put many hundreds of miles under my heels in swamps, deserts, snowy mountains, and open fields. Also, though I dislike it, I have done plenty of trips alone. And also I am no stranger to the ill effects of fatigue, and never have I experienced anything akin to this situation. I say this beforehand, as I am sure these questions and doubts will arrive in your mind later. The first mile I rode on a well-traveled dirt road, passing through open pasture with plenty of grazing cattle on the hillsides and upon the plains, going gently at an incline to the foothills at the base of the mountains. Once at the foothills, there was a fork in the road. One path was going steeply off to the right and on top of a hill which avloved into a ridgeline, and the other path gently inclined to the left and into a tight slot canyon. My intuition told me to go left since the canyon floor had probably been leveled by years of water travel and floods, making it a smooth and simple ride. Boy, was I wrong. The canyon was overgrown in May places with groves of aspens and rabbit brush. Sometimes the aspens were so thick in the tight confines of the canyon, they blocked the sky. In the tight turns of the canyon, sediments piled up into small but very steep, muddy hills. In 2 spots, the canyon opened up into larger clearings about 1.5 acres in size. It was in these spots I found a few cattle resting and grazing. My approach was so silent that I rode right up on the cows without their noticing, and they broke into a panic for a few seconds before realizing I was no threat. It was at the end of the second clearing open area that I came to a spot I would call the Straits. Massive cliffs from both sides of the canyon lowered, and then converged to a bottleneck that was only some 20 feet wide. As I approached the Straits, I was impressed by the geological formation, and took a picture a ways off. When I got to the mouth of the Straits, I had my first moment of distress, let's call it. Almost as if I had crossed a threshold of some kind. When I went one step through the Straits, a massive sudden gust of wind blew, knocking me off balance. At the time, I was surprised and taken back. For a moment, I felt like someone was slamming a door in my face, as if it was done intentionally to make me feel unwelcome. After the surprise faded, I thought that a gust from a mountainside pressure system must have blown through the canyon and been amplified by the sudden bottleneck where I stood. Just coincidental timing. The original thought faded entirely, and I didn't even reflect on it till the next day. I was out deer hunting, and that was at the front of my mind. As I went through the final stretch of the slot canyon, the sky darkened, and the wind increased, blowing into my face. Again, just a storm rolling in, which I was ready for, and welcomed. I was downwind, so the deer would never smell me coming. I hit the end of the trail at a third very large opening and pasture where 6 cows were grazing. To my right was large uphill canyon cutting off to the south from the east to west slot canyon I'd been riding in on. There I planned to ditch my bike and hike up the steep ridges and mountainside on foot, looking into the canyon below for deer while also scanning the slopes. This area of the forest and mountains was far from any sign of roads or humans, other than the horse trail cutting through the canyon I had rode in through, obviously used by cowpokes to herd the cattle in and out. I hid my bike and took off on foot. In the next several hours I did my hunting and scouting. I saw plenty of tracks and fresh scat. I even followed the tracks to a bedding ground and a perfect kill zone. But by the time I found this spot, the day had grown late. I had put in some 3 miles of intense biking, and another 3 of extremely arduous hiking on nearly vertical slopes with my gear. Also, frost had come in a few hours before and was freezing the moisture of my breath onto my beard and moustache, and I did not want to risk getting stuck in a storm. Besides, no deer were out in that weather, and there was no way I'd be packing a carcass out in my exhausted state. I sat on a ridge, ate some food, and stood up to leave. As I did, I slipped in the loose rocks atop the canyon wall, and almost went head over heels to my demise. Luckily, I righted myself and fell into the slope, and used the rocks to break my fall. I looked down to check my footing, and saw a familiar shape between the weathered rocks, a straight-walled cartridge casing. I picked it up and pocketed it. Most all straight-walled cartridges fell out of use by the early 1900s, so I knew it was an Antuique. When I got home and cleaned it up, I saw it to be a .38. 55 manufactured in the 1880s or 90s, it would seem. After the discovery, I began my trip back to the bike. About halfway back to my bike, I began to get a creeping suspicion that I was being watched. I had no reason to feel that way. I heard no noises, nor saw anything alarming, but a feeling of paranoia began to invade my mind in a subtle fashion. It was so subtle I had hardly noticed. When I reached my bike, I felt distress at the fact I had to resituate my pack and strap it down before I could ride. I questioned myself and literally paused and mentally asked myself, "Why are you so up-est man?" trying to make sense of my irritation. My answer to myself was surprising. "Because you're being followed." Panic shot through me like electricity. Before I knew what I was doing, I instinctively snatched my rifle from the tree I had leaned it upon, flicked off safety and scanned all 360 degrees around me. Nothing was there at all, but I couldn't shake the feeling. In fact, the feeling Eva loved, and I began to feel dread. I don't know if any of you readers are familiar with the sensation of dread, so I will describe how it feels to you. It is not like the snap of panic. When panic ensues, we feel a threat, but our minds are still clouded and act on instinct. It's not like fear, which I would say is a crescendo of anxiety, suspension, and suspicion of an ill kind. Dread is a cold, suffocating, fully cognizant recognition that something terrible or evil has undoubtedly found you and is fixing to take you. I didn't know what this something was, but I decided to throw my gear on my back and get out from the trees at the mouth of the canyon and awkwardly ride out to the clearing and set by the cows. If something was hunting me, maybe the cows would see it first while I was saddling up, giving me warning, or maybe one of them would get pounced on instead of me. As I got close to the cows, they backed up a little bit, but stayed nearby and watched as I strapped my pack down. I looked up to scan and see where the cows were looking. Some looked at me, some looked to the canyon I left, and a calf was munching grass, paying no mind at all. In a few minutes I was packed and checked my map to see if there was an alternative route out. My instincts told me that going back the way I came would not be a good choice. Sure enough, the path I had chosen against earlier in the day, the fork to the right, led over and around to the same clearing I was in. This new path was longer though, and I would have to climb to the summit of a steep and large hill first. On the positive side, from the peak down would be all downhill, and I could speedily cruise the hell away from whatever the something was. I jumped on the bike and headed to the base of the trail out. As I drew nearer, I saw I had to pass into another thick, mile-long aspen forest before reaching the bald peak. I didn't like that at all, but my mind told me it was the best option. The hill was steep and muddy. The air was freezing and dry, but the ground was wet. My muscles were burning like hell as I pushed my bike up the slope and slipped in the mud. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Literally. After only a few minutes, my lungs began to burn as well, both from the exertion and the cold air I was sucking in, like bellows trying to power a forge. My mind burned as well. This was no longer a deer hunt. This was an escape. A third of the way up, I began to slow to a zombie-like pace. I paused to breathe, and I heard a soft sound behind me in the distance. I wheeled around, and there, about 60 yards behind me, were the 6 cows, frozen, staring at me. I was relieved for a second and then realized how odd it was. None of the other cows followed me. Also, there were no cow patties along the trail I was on now, something I saw throughout the slot canyon between clearings. I then remembered that pack animals will often follow a led animal into a dangerous area and tail off at a distance in case they get pounced. Reflecting now, I think it's ironic they were doing that, given that I was using them as bait only a bit earlier. As I mused at the possibility, I turned to continue walking and saw something in the woods to my left that confirmed my suspicion. There was the skeleton of a cow well over a year old, about 30 yards into the aspens. With that, I wheeled my rifle from my back to my chest and moved it from full safety to half safety and kept chugging up the hill. I paused several more times for breath, and every time I turned, the cows were there, frozen, staring at me, following me up the hill. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the peak. As I cleared the forest, I saw other cows on the bald peak, grazing bunch grass. I paused to breathe, and the cows who had been following me passed me up and joined their companions. At that, I felt relief. I felt safe again, and I cruised my bike down that hill all the way down to the ranch and back to my car. It was 5 p.m. I threw my bike in the back and went home. I got home, caught up with the wife and kids, ate dinner, and went to sleep with a little mention of what happened. That night I had a nightmare. The feeling of dread returned, and a voice in my head appeared telling me to never go back there again. The voice sounded like mine, but felt like someone else. The message was clear, though. Only bad things awaited me if I returned there. Not wanting to test this, I accepted whatever this something was telling me, and in my dream I told it with my own separate voice that I wasn't going to go back. In the time since all this occurred, I have reviewed that day in my mind, as well as the pictures that I took during the first half of the day. I realize now that creeping sensation of paranoia had been making its way into my mind since the moment that I entered the canyon to the left. My mind was still so focused and excited on getting out to hunt, I didn't recognize my state till later. When I look at some of the photos of the forest that I took, it makes me uncomfortable. After a couple of days had passed, I told my wife the extent of what happened, and I explained to her that I wasn't going to go back to that spot, despite having found good signs for wildlife and hunting. It was during this discussion with her that I realized that the overall sensation that I had was new to me. Part of me felt fear from potential physical harm, nothing new. But the dread that came upon me that day and that night were from something spiritually evil. I've been in bear territory in my life. I've been in wolf territory and bobcat territory. As I said before, I've had plenty of adventures in my free time where I've been alone and in the butt crack of nowhere. I've been tired, fatigued, and hungry and cold. I've heard things move in the forest when I was on my own and been briefly spooked by things. Hell, in the 2 weeks since this happened, I've been out half a dozen other times on my own hunting in very similar situations, but felt absolutely nothing like I did that day. Something was following me, something was trying to get me, something unnatural. I don't know how any of the other stuff that I saw that day ties in, like the cowboy cartridge or the cow carcass, the staring cows. I don't know if they even tie in at all. This could all just be the weird case of mania that I came down with. But what I do know is that I'm going to keep my promise that I made to that something, and I'm not going to go back, or at least not anytime soon.
And so we've woven our way through the shadows, unmasking the horror of the Skinwalker, a specter of shape-shifting terror. In the icy grip of the blood fog, we've revealed the grotesque beneath the mundane, stared into the abyss of the supernatural. To those who've dared to tread this fearful path with us, the Brothers Horror express their deep gratitude. Your courage fuels our dark explorations, your curiosity, a lantern cutting through the inky blackness. As we draw the cloak of night around us, a word of caution. Beware the blood fog, for within its crimson mists, skinwalkers prowl, unseen horrors lurk, and reality is but a mere illusion. Remember, dear friends, the face you see in the fog may not be your own. Until our next grim tale, tread lightly, sleep with one eye open, and may the dread ever linger at the edge of your consciousness. Good night, brave souls. Beware the blood fog.